And Rob's absolutely right. Festival rather than conference, because there's going to be some great concerts and some great presentations, but also a festival of teaching, because there's going to be some amazing presenters talking about new ideas for teaching. And I always learn something from these things. I think it's great. And also in Cardiff, it's going to be lovely. Who came to Oxford 10 years ago? Me. Nobody else. It was amazing in Oxford. It was great. But I think Cardiff could be even better because the facilities there are really great. So do sign up, as Rob said. Get sort of guarantee your place. It'd be great. So we're going to talk about looping. Who am I? Well, Rob sort of said basically who I am. How did I get into looping? I played with some world musicians, for want of a better name, an Indian tabla player and a jazz flamenco guitarist about 20 years ago. And the guitarist was into live looping, and I said, what's that? Nowadays, everybody sort of knows what it is because Ed Sheeran's done it and a few other people. But I thought this is a great way of being able to do stuff on my own. So looping, just in case, I'm sure you all know, but it's basically layering up things live and building up complex arrangements from that. And there are lots of ways you can do it. Now, we've got a very short amount of time tonight, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is, a little bit about the terminology, and do a couple of demonstrations, and actually then talk about some of the gear that you can use if you want to get into that, because it can be very complicated like this. This is more complicated than it needs to be, because the simple things I've had to link in to the more complex things so that I can demonstrate them without changing everything around. So I spent most of the afternoon trying to work out how on earth I was going to do that and put it through Zoom. But that's my problem, not yours. So why loop? I think for me, it's a chance to play pieces that I wouldn't normally as a violinist be able to play. To add layers, to do complex things that would be very hard just on your own. Obviously, we've got wonderful solo violin music like Bach and so on, but it is great to be able to do other things. So I'll start off, I'm going to play you a little demo of an arrangement of a pop song by Coldplay called Clocks. And it's just an example of what you can do with looping. Some simple building up of layers and taking layers away again. The way I've got this set up at the moment, I've got a mic over here which is doing the voice. I'm going to turn that off so that I can do the music for you, and then I'll turn it on again when we go. I've got earpieces in because despite the big speakers behind me, they're just my hi-fi. I'm not plugged into any speakers here, it's all going into Zoom. So that's just so that I can hear my own loops. The one thing about loops is great for your rhythm, because if you don't play in time and you can't hear what you're doing in time, it's never going to work. So we'll do this little demonstration of clocks, and then we'll talk a little bit about the terminology of looping and how it all works. I've got a 5-string electric violin by Bridge, just the normal violin I use. We'll talk about using instruments a little bit later on, but let's just play this. So I'm going to turn my mic off and then play this. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That's a really good, simple piece because, as you can hear, it's built up of little building blocks. And if you're starting looping, I think that's the way to start. I do a lot of arranged looping, so it's fixed arrangements. If I get it wrong, I can't recover because it's got a structure to it. A lot of people do very free improvised looping as well, and that's also great. There are so many ways that you can use it. In terms of the sort of terminology of looping, you record your first loop, and the key thing with that is normally the start point and the end point, because everything else has to link with that. So if you're using a freestanding looper, which I'll demonstrate in a minute, the first click to start recording and the second click to stop recording are absolutely vital. And when I'm doing workshops with students, that's the thing that you've got to get them to do, because they have to do something with their feet which is in sync with their hands. And although we're playing these complex instruments that involve multitasking, adding a foot into that, some students get it really quickly and some really struggle. So it's an interesting thing to try and teach that. Once you've recorded your first loop, you go into what we call an overdub. So you can add another layer, and then you can delete or add other layers. It's very straightforward. You can imagine, if you imagine a sort of timeline with different layers of a song on, that's how we work with the loops. And the complexity that you can achieve is very, very dependent on what software or hardware you use, basically. So the very simplest setup that you can have to start looping would be your instrument, and that can be anything. It could be your voice, it could be percussion, it could be an acoustic instrument, or it could be an electric instrument. You then need something to record. You need a loop pedal to record onto. So you need a way of getting your instrument sound into that pedal. And if it's an electric instrument, that's easy. It's a jack lead. If it's a microphone, it's an XLR lead or whatever, a microphone to the looper. That brings up the key difference between electric instruments and something with a microphone. It's the possibility of getting feedback. So feedback is if you're getting too much of the sound in the room coming back through the speakers that you're using, not a problem with earpieces or headphones. And that's something you've got to be aware of in the type of microphone you use and where you place your amp or your speaker. So you've got your instrument, you've got a way of getting the sound of that instrument into a looper, you've got to have a looper pedal, and then you're going to have a way of making that sound come out, whether that's an amplifier, a hi-fi system, a pair of headphones, whatever. That's the simplest setup. And I'll show you just briefly what I've got here. I've got a little pedal down here, which hopefully with the placement of that you can see it. I just lift it up. That is a standalone loop pedal. It's got two main pedals. It's called a Boss RC30XL, and they don't make them anymore. But they make other ones. You can get more simpler ones and more complicated ones, and you can still buy RC30s on eBay. They're still available and they're very good. I've had that for years. Recently I thought it had blown up in a workshop, but it was just the power supply. Whew. So I bought a new power supply and it's still working. So that's very simple. Basically, I've got the two pedals. When I press one of those pedals, it will start recording. When I press the other pedal, it will stop the loop. So I'm going to press it. As I press it, I will start playing, and that's my first loop. Oh, it's not coming through, is it? You're not getting it through. You're not hearing that, are you? You were hearing it. No, the loop's not working for me here. Because my lovely complicated setup is not talking to Zoom. Let's just try that again. It was working this afternoon, as always with these things. It's an added stress trying to make it work to Zoom. Oh, hello. Trying to make it to work to Zoom as well. Let's try that again. Can you hear that? If I turn my microphone off for a second, tell me if you can still hear it. for whatever reason, that's not working through Zoom. So I'll try it again in a second. That's your basic pedal. So if you want to start looping, you're going to use that standalone pedal with an amp, and you're going to build layers up. The Boss RC30, I'm just going to change the setting here while I'm talking, if I can do this two things at once. Should be able to do ideal looping. Right, that was just while my file changed over, the microphone wasn't working. If you use a standalone pedal, there are a lot of them out there, and the sort of concepts are the same. You will record your one loop and you'll add other loops and you take them away. The RC30 has 2 channels, so you can actually record 2 different sets of loops and swap between them. It's a little bit of fancy footwork holding a pedal down. It will also play it's got little built-in percussion, synth percussion beats as well, so you can set up a beat to go behind. And I had a pupil in Cambridge a few years ago who was really doing a lot with that, just using the built-in beats and then putting violin stuff on top, and actually it's very, very good. So those, I think you can pick them up for around £100 mark, and they're very, very good for that point of view. Let me see if that will just work for again now. I've just changed this setup. Ah, that sounds better. Yeah, okay, I think this is going to work now. So I'm going to press it once, that will start recording. When I press it again, that will stop the first loop, immediately play it, and add the next layer that I do straight away. And now, it's still in overdub mode. Anything I play on the instrument now will be looped. If I was using a microphone into that, my voice will be looping, but it's not picking up that, it's only picking up the instrument. I can just add anything I like at any point. And that's obviously a sort of, call it what you will, 4-bar, 8-bar loop, depending on how you count it. And I can just keep adding layers to that as much as I want. And that's a great tool for a student just to experiment, and so on. And if I want to stop that, I just press the other pedal to stop it, and it's there. So you can also play again, you can play back that loop, and you can improvise on top without it recording. So you've done one press to record, press again to play the loop and start overdubbing, adding layers, and if you press again it will stop overdubbing, and you can just play something on top of the loops you've already got. One of the things that's a little more limited on RC30 is actually taking loops away, and that's where more complex pedals or software come in. While we're talking about standalone pedals, you can also get these days quite a lot of guitar pedals for guitarists, multi-effects pedals, which have a simple looper system built in. So on this one here, if you can see it there, a bigger unit, that's a Line 6 Helix Lite. And that's just basically a guitar multi-effects unit, and it's got a basic looping functions built in. So I'll just again show you the basic looping functions with this. The nice thing about perhaps a multi-effects unit is you can also play around with the sort of effects that you hear from guitarists in pop groups. They're not always ideal for a bowed string instrument, because a plucked sound is fine, which is obviously what guitars are doing. A bowed sound, the way the sound is made is very different. So some of the effects that guitarists use every day really sound terrible on a violin in my experience. But you can still get distortion and delay and flanging and phasing quite nicely if you want to play around with that. So any cheap multi-effects units, or indeed small individual pedal units that you can have one that you particularly like, you can daisy chain those all up with a loop pedal, and then you've got a loops and you can put effects on. So just quick sort of demonstration of this one. I can enter the loop mode here, and I can just play something that I will loop very freely. So that's going to keep playing, and then I can add another layer, as I did with the smaller units. I'll add a couple of layers. Not a particularly nice one, but one of the things that this can do is I can make it go backwards. That's now backwards. And I can go half speed. Maybe of limited use. Shows up your vibrato. But you can do things like that, and then let's stop that. The thing about a unit like this is if I want to, I can also use an effect. So here's a plain sound. I've got things like an octave. And if you combine that with a bit of a delay, maybe that as well. So you can do interesting sounds and then put those into your loops, or do them after the loops, on top of the loops. I find that delays are quite fun to play with, particularly in loops, because with a delay you can change the amount of time before it repeats. You know, a delay is like an echo, it's a repeat. You can change how many times it repeats, and you can change how quickly it decays in that. And so that can give you some really interesting textures. And I think a lot of students probably enjoy just playing around with delay settings. They don't even need a loop pedal, because all effects units will have a delay on them. But if you've got delay and loops, you can do quite a lot on there. Just moving forward from that, what I've ended up doing is using software. When you get into software, you've got a whole new set of maybe problems, but also a set of opportunities. There's a lot of free software out there. If you want to use mobile devices, or your students want to use mobile devices, iPads, I mean, I'm an Apple architecture person, but they're available for Android as well, and Windows. Lots of software, some of it's paid, some of it's free, and it will have different facilities. If you've got free software, what I would suggest, if you've got a student that wants to try looping, or you want to try it yourself, you don't want to buy any hardware at all, then just find a way of getting your instrument into your mobile device or your laptop, and try with a bit of free software. Use headphones for coming out so that you can hear it, but you don't need to get an amp or anything. And one of the ways you can do that, you need an audio interface. So one of the simplest is something like this. I don't know how well you can see that. That's a tiny little audio interface by Apogee called the Jam. And you've got a jack socket in the bottom for your instrument cable, and then on the other side you've got a USB which goes to your computing device, and a headphone out for headphones. And basically something like that, you can do an awful lot with free software. And there are various ones of these that you can get in stores. I mean, Apogee are quite a good make, so that's a slightly more expensive one. But it's very useful. If I want to go have a very quick setup and do a demonstration without all this stuff that you see around, I can just plug that through the instrument and put an amp on the other end, and I've got a loop pedal or an effects box. I've got something simple, or software, but you always need an audio interface. That can work in this setup as well. I've got a bigger interface there because I'm putting more things into it, but basically simple interface like that. If you're only doing one instrument, it's only got one input, so you can only put one instrument into that. But they work very, very well. So that's Apogee Jam, and you can find very similar ones. If you're going down the mobile route, there are various software apps, Mobius and lots of others that do looping. And it's just a question, I think, of just trying some of those out. If it's expensive, check a free one out first, I would say, because you want to just find out the terminology, find out what things do first before you spend any money. The other option you've got with pedal effects is to use something like this. It's a rack unit which you can tie on little single effect pedals. So you can buy single loop pedals that just do a very simple looping. Next to it you could have a single delay pedal, and that's what guitarists, you've seen guitarists with pedal boards. So basically you can make your own little pedal board with that. And actually Dario have just bought out, I just got one of these, it's the box, I haven't actually put it together yet. They've bought out a pedal board called Expand, which is quite good because it will concertina out to take more pedals. So that's a useful thing. That's if you've got another family member, or your student has a brother or something, or family that play in a band, they might have lots of little single effect pedals lying around, and that could be a route to go. I haven't done that. I've always done multi-effects units. When you get into software on a laptop, there are several pieces of software available, but I'll tell you a story about two of the softwares that I've used over the years for looping. First was a fantastic program called Super Looper, with all O's, made by a lovely chap called Jesse Chappell in America. And I used that for years and years, and I've still got it, but he moved on and he stopped supporting it. And that's always the problem if you're going to use software. You have to be careful that if the software stops being developed, unless there's something else that does the same thing, you might be stuck. Currently, I'm using a piece of software called, a very strange name called ALK2 by a company called Zen Audio. Well, Zen Audio closed in lockdown in 2021, and they are no longer making it, supporting it. They've disappeared off the face of the planet. So I have a piece of software which I really like, which I've put lots and lots of setups in for all the concerts that I do. And this laptop that I've got it on, this one here, is not connected to the internet. It is not ever going to be connected to the internet. And one day, if it breaks, I'll have to have hopefully found an alternative by then. But at the moment, it all works on this version of OS X with these other programs, very few other programs. It's my music laptop. And that, again, is just a little danger that you can have with any software, really, but also with looping software, that if you get something like I've got there that I really rely on now, I will have to find an alternative to that if I ever want to change computer, or if I ever want to go to the latest OS X. So I religiously do not ever turn the Wi-Fi on that one. At this stage, has anybody got any questions about what we've talked about so far? Because I'm aware that we've got very little time to cover a very big topic, really. Any questions anybody would like to ask? No. I've either been utterly confusing or very, very clear. Oh, have you got a question? No?
I do have a question, actually. So I've been setting up a looper to use audio input for the cello, but using a microphone.
Yeah.
And I mean, you mentioned that you could go straight into the loop box. I've also got a Boss, but I can't actually do that because it really hasn't got enough volume. And so I do have to go through software. I didn't know if that's my setup is not so good, or whether that's actually a truth if you've got a small diaphragm microphone picking up an acoustic instrument.
Yeah. Depending on the sort of microphone you've got. So some microphones need what's called phantom power.
Yeah, I have phantom power. It's a Shure KSM 141.
The Boss will supply that. I've not tried. I've never actually. Well, very rarely I've ever used that with microphones. I have used it with this studio microphone here, which needs phantom power, and it's worked fine. I haven't had a level problem.
But if I plug it into my PC through Ableton, for example, no problem, it'll work fine. So maybe that's the setup that I have to just check out. I didn't know if you just knew that there's a reason why that just comes out too low volume.
I think the problem that happens sometimes is you've got various inputs that can be changed, and there are lots of things in the signal path that could make it louder or softer. But I couldn't diagnose that one specifically.
Sure, that's okay.
It sounds like you've got an alternative as well, which is good. And
Yeah.
Ableton I've used it a little bit, but it's got a lot of good reviews. It's a clever, complex piece of software.
Definitely is.
Good.
Thanks.
Any other questions at this stage?
I've got a question.
Oh, sorry. Go for it, Rebecca.